So back to our conversation on universal design. We've kind of talked about the history, the big picture of universal design, where it came from, what its intent is. We've talked about the three principles, the multiple means of representation, engagement, and expression. And so how do we plan for universal design? How do we as teachers use the principles of universal design in our classrooms? And it's not one of those things where we can get this new idea and overnight we can revolutionize how we teach. This is one of those things that we really have to take small steps in. And when I'm teaching new teachers about this, it's really hard for me to help new teachers understand UDL because they haven't been teachers yet. They don't have classrooms, which means they don't have a group of students that they love yet. And when we talk about what it means to love our students, right, the thing that predominantly is we love our students so much that we expect the best from them and the best for them. And if you've had a classroom and you know your students, it's a lot easier to think about all of those students, to have all of those students in your heart and your mind as you begin planning for a unit or planning a specific lesson. In the vacuum of higher ed, where future teachers haven't had their classes yet, that's more difficult. And so when I work with practicing teachers and they say, okay, how do we go do this? One of the ideas that I really like, and it's not my idea, I don't remember where I borrowed it, but in every teacher lesson plan book that I ever had in my career, there was a box for each day. And if it was math, maybe I wrote the page numbers that we were covering and then the problems that I was going to have the students do. And it was, once you've taught for a while and you don't create a brand new lesson plan for every lesson, that becomes sort of a shorthand. But I'm not really satisfied with having one box to plan in. And so I was somewhere at some conference and someone explained this very idea, and they put up a tic-tac-toe board. And so 9 squares, and that in each day, if we're having students do independent practice or even some guided practice, that there shouldn't just be one way for them to demonstrate what they've learned, that there should be multiple ways. There's a quote from Michael J. Fox that says, sometimes, I'm paraphrasing, sometimes when kids don't respond to the curriculum, it's not the kids that's broken, it's the curriculum that's broken. And then in our classrooms, we should work to make difference normal. And I remember in first grade, we were divided into reading groups, right? And they were probably something like the Redbirds and the Bluebirds. And one group was the advanced readers and one group was the slow readers. And everybody who was a slow reader knew they were a slow reader. And every advanced reader knew they were an advanced reader and who the slow readers were. And it's like we mentioned earlier that people will conceive of themselves the way others conceive of them. And so creating that difference created separation and barriers between students. So why don't we make difference normal? Why isn't it okay for students to be working on different things at different times or using different methods to demonstrate their understanding of something? And so this is where this tic-tac-toe board comes in. And so you can just imagine a tic-tac-toe board in your head. And so if it was going to be time for guided practice, I like to divide the tic-tac-toe into levels, and I think about Bloom's levels of taxonomy when I do that. And so the 3 activities or 3 assignments that I create in that top row, they tend to be really straightforward. Call, recall, identification, those kinds of things. The steps at the bottom tend to be that synthesis, right? And then those in the middle. And so as I'm creating these activities, 3 at each level, and so then maybe on my PowerPoint or my overhead, or I'm handing out to the students, here are the activities that you can choose from during this time. It's not a lot different than that period of education where we had center-based learning, right? Where students would move from center to utilize different means of developing skills. And there'd always be some rule for what assignments had to be done on the tic-tac-toe. And so one day I might say, okay, class, everybody's going to do either an up and down row or a diagonal row. So they got to do one of the low level, one of the medium level, one of the high level. But prior to all of this, maybe at the beginning of a semester or at the beginning of a school year, If I was doing this for math and I had a student with a specific learning disability in the area of math, I might take them aside and say, okay, every time that we do this, I want you to do 3 across the top. Even if I say do up and down or diagonal to the rest of the class, for you, it's always the 3 across the top. Similarly, if I had a student who was gifted, or not even identified as gifted, but just really talented in math, I might say to that student, okay, every time we do this, you're always going to do the 3 across the bottom. No matter what I tell the rest of the class, you're a 3 across the bottom. Nobody else in the class knows that I've had these conversations. Everybody's busy working on their own thing, so nobody really is aware of another student doing something that's different, because every student is doing something different. So we've made different normal. And there's not then that separation of, oh, that's the smart kid doing the smart kid assignment, and oh, that's the slow learner doing the slow learner assignment, because everyone is doing something different. And so that was just the easiest way, or the most accessible way, or the way that clicked for me to plan when it came to UDL. Now, none of us are going to have the time to go through, in a week in the summer, every unit, every assignment, and create that more robust means of having students demonstrate their information, or creating new ways to present the information. And so the suggestion that I picked up for new teachers, for young teachers, is, okay, pick one lesson. And in this quarter, do one lesson where you really embody these principles. And then the next quarter, pick another lesson. And just like everything as a teacher, over time we build. And no, not every single lesson is going to embody all 3 principles of UDL in the first year that you teach. But maybe in the 5th year that you teach, you've built up a collection of these lessons and these activities and these ideas. And so then, in the 3rd or the 5th year, most of what you're doing embodies that. So this isn't something to get overwhelmed with, that you have to change everything all at once, but change a few things and see how they go, and learn from that process. So that's the best advice as I have from planning for UDL. If you go back to that website that I mentioned earlier, that cast.org, you'll have to poke around a little bit, but as you explore that page, they actually have a really good resource for different grade levels, different topics within subject areas, and how other teachers have designed lessons utilizing those principles. And it's all free. It's one of the websites that I tell my pre-professional teachers to bookmark in your web browser and always keep around, because you can go back to that in the future. So that's a good resource if you think about planning. Now, there are some criticisms as it relates to UDL, and the biggest criticism that I hear from practicing teachers is, well, doesn't this idea of UDL take away the rigor of our academic content? And I don't think that it does. I understand where that question comes from, right? There's a sociologist from the 1970s called Chuck Lordy, and he wrote a book called The School Teacher. And his goal was to understand what controls the work of a teacher, or where do we really learn to be teachers. Now, as someone who's involved in the training of pre-service teachers, I'd like to believe it's what we do with them in the School of Education at Benedictine. But in reality, in Lordy's research, he found that most of what we do as a teacher is a reflection of what was done to us when we were K-12 learners. And so, for example, I don't know when you gave your first spelling test as a teacher. In high school, I took a teacher's aid course, and so every morning for the first hour, I went to our local elementary school and helped out in a 5th grade classroom with the same teacher I'd had in 5th grade. And I remember the first Monday I was in there, he said, "Do you want to give the spelling test?" I was like, "You bet I want to give the spelling test," right? And I'd never had a class in how to give a spelling test. Nowhere in our program at Benedictine is there a class or a lesson on how to give a spelling test. But we all know that when it's time to give a spelling test, you say the word, you use the word in a sentence, you say the word again, you create a sort of uncomfortable level of pause, and then you say the next word. Use it in a sentence, say it again, uncomfortable pause. We all know how to do that because every Monday and Friday of our young academic career, we took a spelling test. And so Lordy says that most of what we do in classrooms is actually a reflection of what was done to us. And that makes a lot of sense, right? So if we see rigor in an academic setting as, a college class where a professor writes notes on a board and we write those notes down into our notes, and then maybe we recopy those notes and we study those things and we represent those notes on a test a few weeks later, it's hard to see these ideas of UDL as also being rigorous. When I was in the 7th grade, I had a language arts teacher, and we came back from Christmas break, and for the first 9 weeks, she engaged in this new way of teaching. And she handed us all what we would come to know as contracts the first day that we were back from Christmas break. And the contract had like 18 options for assignments. And I remember sitting there looking at this contract, looking at these 18 items, and almost immediately I found 10 things that in no way seemed difficult. They were like things that I would do anyway. One of them was to read a biography and give a book report as if you were the person from the biography. Another one was to read a novel and create like a trifold brochure for that novel. Today that might be, a Prezi or a PowerPoint or something like that. And so I circled these 10 things, and I looked at, we were contracting for a letter grade, and you had to do 9 things to get a B. And I was like, oh, this is perfect. I do 9 things that I would probably do anyway. I get a B. This is going to be the easiest quarter of my life. And then I thought to myself, okay, that's not going to fly at home, because if my parents learned that I contracted for a B, they're going to be upset, right? If I end up with a B and I've done my best, that's okay. But if I only aim at a B, that's going to be a problem. And so I had to pick 2 more things to contract for that A. And so I looked through and I found the 2 things that seemed somehow less hard. And so, that was in the morning. And then at lunchtime, I'm sitting by my friend Jake. And Jake says, hey, what'd you pick? And so I told him, my 12 or the 12 that I could, of the 12 I could remember. And he was like, why'd you pick the hard ones? And I was like, I didn't pick the hard ones. I picked the easy ones. And he's like, no, I picked the easy ones. I'm like, what'd you pick? And he told me. I was like, no, that's hard. But we both left that conversation with the sense that somehow we'd really pulled the wool over our teacher's eyes and, played this trick that we were somehow able to do all these super easy assignments. Now, the fact of the matter is the teacher designed all of those assignments. They were just as rigorous as she wanted them to be. We picked the things that we thought were easy because they matched our learning styles. They were things that we knew how to do. They weren't any less rigorous. They weren't any less relevant. They weren't any less important. They just happened to match us as learners. And so when we answer this question about rigor as it's associated with UDL, the teacher has the power to create the assignments. Like I said earlier, if I'm a math teacher, we're probably, not writing a short story about math. If I'm a language arts teacher teaching the 5-paragraph themes, we're probably not creating a poster. We're writing an essay. And so we have to honor the rigor and what we need for the subject that we're teaching. But beyond that, we as the creators of these assignments become the gatekeeper of rigor. So that's a criticism that I spent some time explaining it, but it's not something that I spend a lot of time worrying about because the teacher picks. And so that's really our conversation about UDL. We started with the big picture. We talked about the 3 principles: multiple means of representation, expression, and engagement, and some criticisms, how to plan. Again, I've kind of only scratched the surface of UDL. If you do a search on Amazon, there's some really excellent books related to universal design in the classroom, and the website that I've talked about before, cast.org, is just a wealth of information. But I do think universal design, the term that we use a lot today, is differentiated instruction. I personally believe that universal design is the most efficient means of differentiated instruction. And I also believe it's one of the most efficient means to include those learners who may have an IEP into the classroom. Because, like I said earlier, 85% of the accommodations, or 85% of the students that we need to accommodate for, those accommodations are very easy to make. Ron Edmonds says we already know what we need to know to do that. And so I think if teachers utilize the principles of UDL in the public schools, we'd see a lot fewer kids referred to special education for services. And in the Catholic schools, we'd be able to accommodate those kids in a much greater way. And the other thing about using these principles, the other thing about inclusion, so data shows that when we include students with disabilities alongside their non-disabled peers, that's what we call in the least restrictive environment, when a student with a disability is included with their non-disabled peers to the maximum extent possible, we see two things. For those students with more significant disabilities, we see their social skills and their communication skills improving. For the students without disabilities, we see their test scores improve. And that seems a little counterintuitive. What is it about the average test score of a class that goes up when we include students with disabilities? But here's the thing. When we use things like UDL, when we engage these research-based practices that have come out of special education and the research in special education for decades, we're not just sprinkling fairy dust on top of the heads of the students with disabilities that somehow make them learn better. We're utilizing tools in our classroom that everybody can benefit from. And you know, as I think about identifying a student, say, for a learning disability, what's the difference? You know, where is the line of struggle that says you have a disability and you don't? And the person that doesn't, that still struggles almost as much, they still need support. And so providing those high quality instructional practices to all students benefits the kids with disabilities and the kids without disabilities. So it's really the tide that rises all ships. So UDL, give it some thought, do some extra reading, and I hope you find it useful.